In one small town, where an ominous silence enveloped every street after sunset, a group of friends lived. They were Jenny, Mike, Lara, and Eric. 4 people united not only by friendship, but also by a passion for exploring abandoned places. Every weekend, they chose a new direction for their adventures. Sometimes it was old hospitals, sometimes abandoned schools, and sometimes just empty houses, about which there were terrible rumors. One day, after watching a horror movie about an abandoned psychiatric hospital, the guys decided that they needed to check out one such hospital located on the outskirts of the city. The locals had long since left it, and it was said that terrifying things had happened there. Unexplained disappearances, strange screams, and mysterious lights that flickered in the windows, although there was not a single person inside. This evening, filled with excitement, they gathered flashlights, cameras, and food to arrange a sleepover in this creepy place. On the way to the hospital, they laughed and jokingly discussed what was waiting for them. But when they reached the place, all the joy and fun instantly disappeared. In front of them stood an old, abandoned psychiatric hospital with cracks in the walls and neglected windows that looked like eyes watching them. The gloomy appearance and ominous atmosphere made them freeze for a moment, but the thirst for adventure and courage soon took over. The first night in the hospital began with funny conversations and a game of scary stories. They sat down in an old hall surrounded by isolated wards, and their laughter seemed to resound through the corridors that had not heard a living voice for a long time. However, as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. Frightening sounds from the dark corridors and strange shadows dancing on the walls became more and more noticeable. Soon, when all the excitement subsided and silence fell, one of his friends, Eric, suggested holding a game. Everyone should tell their scariest story. It was supposed to be a fun start to their night, but one of them seems to have become very nervous. Lara, for example, noticed that there was a strange tension in the air, and Mike, always a joker, suddenly fell silent when he climbed an old staircase that seemed to lead nowhere. When they started telling their stories, one by one, they didn't know that there was actually something watching them in the dark corridors. Screams and whispers, once imagined, have now become scary and real. The game they had conceived as entertainment was turning into something terrible. As the night went on, the friends began to notice strange things. The lights of the flashlights suddenly flickered, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. At some point, when they were sitting in the old office, they could hear someone whispering. Lara, frightened, jumped up from her seat. "Who's there?" she screamed, but the answer was only a silent whisper that seemed to be somewhere close, but no one could figure out where it was coming from. Friends decided that it was just the wind or a game of their mind, but when Eric got up to check what was going on, he noticed that something was moving in one of the wards. He overcame his fear and came closer, and at that moment, a piercing scream rang out in the room. It was something that seemed to break the silence. There was a fear ahead of them that they could not even dream of. The friends began to panic, packing their things, but suddenly, the doors of the wards closed with a thud. They were trapped inside, and then the panic reached its peak. "Who closed the doors?" Mike shouted. "We have to get out of here." But their attempts to open the doors were in vain. They started knocking and shouting, but the sounds did not reach other rooms. The hospital seemed to come alive, and its walls shrank around them. As if responding to their screams, a woman came out of one of the wards, her face pale and her eyes empty. She walked slowly, almost weightlessly, and in her hands were white bandages stained with something dark. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice hoarse as if she hadn't spoken in centuries. Friends, frozen with fear, could not take their eyes off her empty expression. At that moment, fear overwhelmed them, and they tried to figure out what was going on. But the hospital didn't seem to give them a chance. Suddenly, there were sounds again, footsteps, screams, and it seemed that someone else was in this place. Someone who was more sinister than they could imagine. Lara, overcome with horror, suggested, "We must find a way out." They began to move towards the stairs, but every movement seemed like someone was watching them. They heard strange noises, and at some point, someone locked them in the hallway. Their pulse was pounding in their ears, and fear gripped them when they realized that something was wrong. As they searched for a way out, one by one, the friends began to disappear. First Mike disappeared, then Lara, leaving Eric and Jenny alone, panic-stricken. They both knew it was time to run. Suddenly, Eric heard a groan coming from one of the wards. Despite his fear, he headed there, confident that there was someone there who could help them. When he looked inside, he saw something he would never be able to forget. Lara was tied to a chair, her face was in tears, and her eyes were full of horror. "Eric, help me." "Stop it," she screamed. But as he got closer, there was a sharp sound, and the door slammed shut behind him. From that moment on, fear finally took over Eric. He started running through the corridors, his mind desperately searching for a way out. Suddenly, he remembered another path, something he had once seen on the old hospital plan. He ran out into the street, where he found himself in the shadow again. The shadow of the girl he could not forget. When he ran outside, he noticed that the night had become even darker. The moon had disappeared behind clouds, and strange noises were heard all around. Trying to remember where Jenny had been, he realized with horror that none of them could return. Everyone was gone, and he was left alone. In the midst of the chaos, in the distance, Eric saw something glowing. He rushed to this light, hoping for salvation. But when he got closer, he was seized with fear. It was not a door, but a window through which he saw everything that happened in the hospital. He saw how Lara was dragged into the darkness, how Mike tried to get out, but found himself surrounded by the ghosts of the past. At that moment, Eric realized that he would not be able to escape. The hospital had taken them away, and now she was demanding more. He was the last one, and fear seized him when he realized that his time was running out. He returned inside, ready to meet his destiny. But as soon as he entered, everything disappeared. Suddenly, there was a deafening sound, and he was left alone, in the void, with the realization that he would never see his friends again. Eric stood there, unable to believe what had happened. The gloomy corridors of the hospital, filled with the shadow of his friends, now seemed to him like a trap from which there was no way out. He was trying to remember how they got here and what went wrong. The hospital, once just an excuse for funny jokes, turned into a terrible hell, where every echo seemed to be a harbinger of something sinister. As he began to move on through the corridors, his heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind was fighting panic. Every shadow, every sound made him freeze, as if he were the target of some evil that had sent this hospital on them. He remembered Lara, her screams still ringing in his ears. He had to find her. He had to try to help her, even if it might cost him his life. He returned to the very office where he had seen Lara. His courage was almost gone, but he knew he had to move on. Suddenly, a strange sound came from around the bend. It was a faint moan, and it seemed to come from outside the door. Eric walked over to it and carefully opened it. Inside, he saw an eerie sight. Lara was tied to someone on the floor. Her face was distorted with fear, and shadows were darting around her. Eric rushed to her, but at that moment the door slammed shut behind him. He turned around in horror and saw the same woman with empty eyes who was standing right in front of him. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice sounding shrill and unnatural. "You can't save her. There is no escape here." Eric, despite the horror that gripped him, felt the adrenaline rush through his veins. "What did you do to her?" he shouted, trying to hold back the panic attacks. "Let her go." The woman just smiled, and it was a smile full of evil. "She's not alone. You all belong to this place now," she said, and her words sounded like a sentence. Eric realized that this was not just an abandoned hospital. It was a place that had become a grave for those who had once been here. Meanwhile, at the other end of the hospital, Jenny, who had managed to take refuge in one of the wards, was trying to comprehend what was happening. She could hear Eric and Lara's screams, and her heart was constricted with horror. Suddenly the door opened, and the same ominous ghost appeared on the threshold. "You can't hide from me," she whispered, her voice sounding like the whisper of the wind. Jenny felt fear creep over her, but she knew she couldn't give up. She had a plan. She had to find Eric and get them both out of this hellish place. She started to move towards the hallway, but before she could take a step, footsteps sounded from behind. It was Mike. his face pale and his eyes full of fear. "I thought you were missing," he said, and there was fear in his voice. "What's going on? Where are Eric and Lara?" Jenny asked, her heart pounding like crazy. "I do not know," he replied, trying to pull himself together. "We have to get out of here. There's something wrong here." But before they could decide what to do next, that very ghost appeared from the shadows, and her hands began to move as if she was trying to grab them. The friends quickly returned to the room, closing the door. Their breathing was heavy, and their hearts were pounding in unison with the darkness around them. They looked at each other, and at that moment, an understanding seized them. They were not alone. The hospital seemed to be watching them, studying their fears and emotions. "What should we do?" Jenny asked, her voice trembling with fear. "We can't stay here." Mike gathered his strength and said, "We need to find a way out. If Lara and Eric are still here, we have to save them." They decided that they would split up. One of them would look for Eric, and the other would try to find Lara. As soon as they started moving in different directions, fear and despair fell on them like a heavy curtain. Jenny found herself in an old psychiatric office full of dust and cobwebs, where old documents were scattered on the floor. She noticed a photograph on the wall. They were people who once lived here, and their faces were distorted with horror. Meanwhile, Mike came across a staircase leading down. He began to descend, hoping to find at least some clue about what happened to Lara and Eric. Each step seemed slow, and the shadows around him seemed increasingly menacing. He stopped when he heard a pounding. It sounded like a heartbeat. He followed the sound, and when he got closer, he saw Lara sitting on the floor in an empty room. "Lara," he shouted, rushing towards her. She raised her head, and there was hope in her eyes, but also horror. "Mike, I can't get up," she whispered, and her voice sounded like an echo of fear. He tried to lift her up, but at that moment there was a sharp crack, and the doors of the ward slammed shut, cutting them off from the exit. "What's going on?" he shouted in panic, but his words went unanswered. They were both trapped. Eric, meanwhile, ran into the same woman again. She stood in front of him like a ghost, and her face was full of malice. "You can't leave until you pay for your sins," she said. Suddenly, a sound came out of the darkness that made Eric flinch. It was the screams of his friends. He realized that they were in danger. He gathered his strength and rushed forward, ignoring the fear and incomprehensible whispers around him. He ran out into the hallway where all his friends were together, but they were surrounded by dark shadows. "This way," he shouted, running up to them. They all gathered, and their eyes were filled with horror. "We have to find a way out now." Suddenly, the walls of the hospital began to shake, and the whole world around them began to change. The shadows rose and fell as if it were a living being, and they realized that time was running out. Eric, Lara, Jenny, and Mike began to move towards the stairs, trying to find at least some crack in this nightmare. When they reached the first floor, a shrill scream rang out, and everyone stopped. They saw the same woman leap out of the shadows, ready to grab them. They rushed to the exit, but the doors seemed to have disappeared. The hospital wasn't going to let them go. The screams grew, and the fear reached its peak when they realized that this whole night was not just a game. It was a real struggle for survival, and each of them now realized that everything that was happening here could only end in one thing: final failure. Eric, gathering all his strength, shouted, "Look, the window!" They all rushed towards him, but when they were almost there, the darkness engulfed them again. It was the last thing they could see when they tried to escape from this hell. In the dark, they desperately searched for a way out, each of them aware that time was running out. The walls of the hospital seemed to shrink, and the corridors seemed endless, each turn leading to an even greater abyss of fear. Eric, Lara, Jenny, and Mike could barely hear their own voices due to the loud sound of their own heartbeats when they reached the window, which seemed to be the only way to escape. The window they hoped to escape through was boarded up from the outside. It was one of those old windows with iron bars that seemed to have been there from the very beginning. Eric frantically started tapping on the glass while the others looked around for something that could help them. There was a feeling inside him that they were not alone, as if someone was watching their every move. "We can't give up," he shouted, unable to suppress his excitement. "There is another way." The shadows in the corridors were becoming more and more menacing, and Eric knew they had to act quickly. He turned around and, while waiting for an answer from the others, saw that Lara was clutching something in her hand. It was an old toy that she accidentally found on the floor. She looked at it as if it was her only connection to reality. "It's just a toy, but," she began, her voice choked with fear. "It reminds me that we were children once, and we had hope. Maybe we can try to get out of here by remembering who we are." Mike looked at her, then at the others, and they all nodded in agreement. At that moment, a sound attracted their attention. Someone began to whisper from the darkness. It was a low, threatening whisper, and it sounded like it was coming from the hospital itself. Eric, unable to ignore it, walked closer to the hallway. "Who's there?" "What is it?" he asked, but no one answered his question. The whispers grew louder, and Eric felt fear creep over him. "We have to leave now," Jenny screamed, grabbing Lara's hand. She knew that every moment counted. Eric looked at his friends, and the four of them rushed into the hallway. As they ran, the hospital seemed to hold its breath. Every door they passed was ajar, and eerie sounds came from inside. They were screams and moans. Eric tried to focus, knowing that if they didn't get out, they would become part of this grim story. "Hurry up," he repeated as they crossed a long corridor, and suddenly they came across a staircase leading down. Their hope was revived, and they eagerly rushed down. When they reached the lower floor, a wide, high-ceilinged room opened up in front of them, where there had once been many patients. The walls were scuffed, and the furniture had long been covered with dust. A strange smell of rot mixed with the smell of medicines, and Eric felt his stomach cramp with fear. In the center of the room was a large table covered with medical instruments, some of which looked eerily familiar. Eric recoiled when his gaze fell on an old syringe still full of brown liquid. He knew that this place had become a grave for many, and now it wanted to take them with it. "We have to find a way out," Mike said, looking around. "Wherever he is, we have to try." But at that moment, a strange noise was heard, and the friends froze. A figure appeared from one of the doors leading to the utility room. It was the ghost, the woman with the empty eyes and the sinister smile. She moved slowly as if enjoying their fear. "You won't be able to leave," she said, her voice filled with icy contempt. "This hospital is your home. You have become a part of her story." Eric and his friends felt their hearts tighten with fear. "No, we can't stay here," Eric shouted, but as soon as he said it, they all felt the floor begin to sway under their feet. The hospital seemed to come alive, and the walls began to shrink around them. Mike shouted, and they all rushed to the exit, even though the woman was approaching them. Every step was filled with terror, and every scream sounded like a harbinger of their final doom. They were back in the hallway, but now it looked different, as if it had changed in those minutes, becoming even more confusing. Eric realized that they were trapped, and no matter how hard they tried, this place would not let them go. Suddenly, he noticed a door at the end of the corridor. It was ajar. Eric shouted to his friends, "There, maybe this is the way out." They rushed forward, and when they reached the door, Eric barely opened it, and at that moment they felt fresh air blowing over their faces. There was a narrow staircase leading up behind the door. With hope in their hearts, they began to climb, but they heard footsteps behind them. The footsteps of a ghost who was not going to let them go. Jenny screamed, their eyes darting in search of a way. They understood that time was running out, and if they didn't get out now, they would stay here forever. When they reached the top landing, they were overcome by a feeling of wild joy. But this feeling did not last long. They found themselves in another room full of old hospital beds. This place was gripped by fear and expectation. Suddenly, there was a crackling sound in the silence, and one of the beds began to move slowly. Eric felt his heart stop. They were trapped again. A shadow came out from behind the bed, and the same woman appeared with her again. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice sounding like a hollow bell. At that moment, Eric realized that they would not be able to escape this fate, and overcome with despair, he decided that they must fight this evil. "We are not afraid of you," he shouted, and his friends stood next to him, huddled in a single line. It was their only chance, and they knew they had to fight to the end. The hospital could no longer take them away. They had to get their lives back on their own. Gathering their strength, they began to advance on the ghost. Each step was full of determination. It was the last thing they could do to escape from this hell. They were ready to fight the dark past that haunted them. With this determination, they rushed forward, ready for the most terrible battle of their lives. The battle broke out in this gloomy hall, and each of them, clutching their fears in their fists, was ready to do everything possible to escape from this hell. With each step forward, their confidence grew, despite the fear that overwhelmed them. Eric, Lara, Jenny, and Mike got together, and when faced with the ghost woman, they realized that the only thing they needed was to join forces and confront this horror. "You can't take us away," Eric shouted, and his voice sounded loud and confident, as if he was looking for support not only from friends, but also from himself. At that moment, they began to move in sync, using the power of unity. Each of them tried to remember who they were before they found themselves in this nightmare and what they had lost. The woman stopped for a moment, her face contorted as she noticed that their spirits were not broken. It was her weak point. She seemed to be trying to keep them in place, but each of the friends felt that if they didn't back down, they could overcome her influence. "We are not your property," Jenny screamed, and her words seemed to break the silence. At that moment, the entire hospital around them seemed to tremble. The walls began to disintegrate before their eyes. All the creepy memories that were hiding here began to surface, as if trying to get out of this hell. "You can't leave until you've fulfilled your role," the woman said, and her voice sounded like the whistling of the wind filling every corner of the hall. There was something threatening in her words, and for a moment they all froze. But it was at that moment that Eric remembered what they had been through together. They were friends, and this connection gave them strength. "We are here to live, not to become a part of your story," he shouted. The four of them held hands, and their resolve grew stronger by the second. They felt the energy coming from them growing and filling the space. It was not just a protest against a woman. It was an affirmation of their right to life. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, as if the hospital itself had surrendered under their onslaught. Eric noticed how the walls began to crack and crumble, and the ghost retreated, shrinking under their combined strength. Mike shouted, and they wasted no time heading for the exit. They were followed by a dull sound, as if the hospital was trying to stop them, but with each step, the friends felt the darkness recede. When they finally reached the door leading to the street, they came across a threshold that had not been opened for a long time. Eric pushed the door open with all his might, and to their surprise, it opened with a loud creak, letting them out. Outside, they were greeted by a cold wind that embraced them like an old friend. They stood on the threshold, looking at the ruins of the hospital that had once threatened them. For a moment, they thought they were already safe, but it wasn't that simple. "It's not over yet," Lara said, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to tell others what happened here." They slowly walked away from the entrance, realizing that everything that had happened had to be told. This place must be sealed so that no one else falls victim to that shadow that now remains only in their memories. Suddenly, Eric looked at his friends, and his heart sank with the realization of how close they were to death. He would never forget those moments of fear when they fought with themselves and with the darkness that sought to engulf them. "We must become the voices of those who could not get out," he said. And at that moment, they all realized that their struggle for life was just beginning. They set off, determined to tell their story and prevent this tragedy from happening again. In the distance, behind them, the hospital finally collapsed, as if admitting defeat. This was the last evidence of her horrors, leaving only a cold wind that could no longer intimidate anyone. Nevertheless, each of them had a shadow of fear in their hearts forever. They survived, but their lives will never be the same. The horrors they had endured would always haunt them, but now they were free.